Florida, my legislative brother, Mr. Diaz-Balart, a member of the Committee on Appropriations and a champion of freedom, democracy, and human rights in the Western Hemisphere and around the world. Mr. Diaz-Balart to close.
The gentleman from Florida is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, thank you, sir, very much. I also rise in support of this important resolution, the Venezuelan Human Rights and Democracy Protection Act. And I first, Mr. Speaker, want to start by thanking my dear friend, a tireless champion for human rights and democracy around the world. You know, she has thanked, and rightfully so, a number of people who have helped with this important legislation. But we would not be dealing with this issue on the floor if it wasn't for the tireless effort, the constant tireless struggle and fight and solidarity and efforts of my dear friend, my sister, Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen. Those people around the world who are struggling in gulags and struggling for their freedom know that they have in Ileana Ros-Lehtinen a true champion. And once again, we see that leadership here today. Mr. Speaker, since mid-February, the people of Venezuela, led mostly by students, by the way, have risen up to protest the corruption, the food shortages, the crime rates, the alarming repression that have worsened during the Maduro's few months in office, in control. In response to these legitimate, peaceful grievances, Mr. Speaker, the Venezuelan regime, what they've done is they have ordered security forces to brutally crack down, brutally, with great force and brutality, crack down on the opposition. They've used unlawful force. They've used severe beatings and beatings of unarmed protesters, mostly students. And by the way, even shooting some of them point blank. They even jailed some of the main opposition leaders on phony charges, Mr. Speaker. And since the protests began, if you've already heard, more than 40 people have been killed. About 3,000 people have been arrested. Many have disappeared, and hundreds more have been injured, Mr. Speaker. And in addition, Maduro's regime has instituted a virtual media blackout, blocking images even over the internet, and, by the way, even expelling journalists, including CNN and NTN. Just this past weekend alone, the Venezuelan regime blocked CNN, a news crew, from covering local elections. Obviously, they don't want anybody there that can show when and how they're stealing those sham elections. And it's shameful, Mr. Speaker, that the Chavez-Maduro regime, the policies, have managed to really get one of the richest economies in Latin America, the largest oil exporter in Latin America, and they've made it, frankly, a poverty-ridden nation. People now face shortages of some of the most basic commodities, Mr. Speaker. And by the way, inflation is about 50% over the last year. So no wonder the people are struggling. Maduro has intensified his intimidation tactics, though, by increasing political arrests, by militarizing his response, using thugs to respond to the peaceful opposition members and students who are in the streets demanding freedom. He's been labeling those unarmed opposition leaders as terrorists and also enemies of the state. We've heard before, Mr. Speaker. This bill, frankly, just directs our administration to rightly deny visas, to freeze assets and prohibit financial transactions to the members of the Venezuelan regime responsible, Mr. Speaker, those responsible for committing these human rights abuses. So these corrupt cowards, who now have blood on their hands, they shouldn't be allowed to travel to our country while they continue to brutalize their fellow citizens, the students who are in the streets just demanding freedom, the regaining of their sovereignty. It's time to hold these human rights abusers accountable. Those complicit with those egregious acts of human rights violations, Mr. Speaker, you know, they have to be named. They must be named, and they must be named and shamed. And they need to suffer the consequences of their actions. So Mr. Speaker, I have the great fortune and privilege of representing a patriotic and vibrant Venezuelan American community in southern Florida. You know, they continue to bring the attention to these deplorable conditions, those in Venezuela, while the vast majority of the international community, that some would like us to yield to their wishes, but yet they're not saying anything. The Venezuelan people are standing up, in many cases dying in the streets, and the vast majority of the international community is silent. So some would have us just also be silent. Well, with the passage of this bill, the United States House of Representatives will send a strong signal that we stand in solidarity with the Venezuelan people as they struggle to regain democracy, to regain their freedom from the Maduro regime. This House, the United States of America, the People's House, stands with them. So I urge the support of my colleagues on this resolution. I know that I keep hearing, I've heard a little while ago, people that I greatly respect, well, but not all Venezuelans support sanctions. No, the regime doesn't support the sanctions. But this House, led by this leader, right here sitting next to me, was instrumental in strengthening sanctions against Iran when a lot of the international community was against it. And frankly, when the administration, our own administration, was lukewarm at best. But this House stood firm. This House stands for freedom and democracy. And today, once again, this House can stand proudly, side by side, with those who are giving their all in the streets of Venezuela to regain their freedom, their sovereignty, and their dignity. With that, Mr. Speaker, I urge the support of this important legislation, and I yield back the remaining part of our time.